All right, so I'm Ken Levine, the creative director of Irrational Games, and I am here with...
Nate Wells. I'm the art director of Irrational Games.
Sean Robertson, lead artist.
And normally we, I just came off an E3 where I made a big deal out of saying, well, we don't talk over our demos. We let our demos speak for themselves. And yeah, we're not going to do that today. We're going to talk over our demo. But I do highly recommend that you just sort of watch it without us jabbering over it first. There's a million sites you can find it on GameSpot, etc. Now that said, after you watch it, come back and hear us. If you're interested, hear us talking about the making of this E3 demo. So let's roll it.
I love that logo.
That's us.
Oh, here's where we're talking about how
Oh,
awesome
sorry.
we
Yeah,
are.
we
Sorry,
we
we're
don't want to
awesome.
talk over
Awesome.
this.
God, we're so awesome.
We're numerically awesome.
There we go.
So that logo, we can talk quickly about it because it lasts very short. That is a sort of an update of the original Bioshock logo. We sort of wanted to feel similar in style. The original Bioshock logo had all this water effects.
Yeah, it gradually rusted. This one gets gradually windblown because Columbia's in the sky. It's been in the sky for a while.
We had to have this moment very late where they were outside the store talking about it because we realized nobody had no idea what the hell Elizabeth and Booker were doing.
Yeah, we needed to establish a store.
We just kind of threw you into this store. Nobody had any sense of where you were. The hobo bed is my favorite.
Hobo bed.
So this whole sequence with Booker and Elizabeth, this also didn't exist when we first started working on the demo in the store. Originally we started with the bit where the songbird arrives, but we really wanted just to have a very Bioshocky moment of what's more Bioshocking than going through some abandoned store looking for loot. We really wanted to have a Bioshocky moment that felt very, very familiar, but also what is that like to have a Bioshock moment which is normally solitary with Booker and Elizabeth alone for the ride, and really help establish Elizabeth's character, before you get to the serious drama stuff, which you just sort of like to hang out with
Clowning
Elizabeth.
around wearing the Lincoln mask.
And that's something, that wasn't written early on. This was a reaction to what was going on in the store. So we started building props for the store, and we had Lincoln masks and we had these gold busts that, writing these scenes was a reaction to what was actually in the store.
Yeah, we saw, we see, the gold bust was there, and I'm like, oh, well, wouldn't it'd be cool if Elizabeth thought this was real gold and give her a little bit of business. And this is basically where the demo originally started, and we just, we thought there was a real opportunity to sell character first.
Yeah.
So, Nate, you want to talk about the challenges and Sean, talk about the challenges of building this sequence? Were there any challenges?
Yeah, I mean, definitely.
Certainly animation challenges that Sean can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to sell, obviously, that the songbird is tracking you, and that you're stuck inside of this store with Elizabeth. And we didn't want to reveal too much of the songbird at this moment, so we constructed a space that kind of gives you a little glimpse of what the songbird is without letting on too much, and showing at the same time just how fearful Elizabeth is of being taken by him. And this is a good introduction to her saying very explicitly that she would rather die than go back to the songbird.
Yeah, we really wanted to have the whole... the whole demo to have a story to it, like a beginning, middle, and end, and it's thematically tied to the larger story of the game because it's actually part of the real. This is actually part of the real game. I'm sure it will change somewhat when the game ships, but this whole bit where Elizabeth, telling her story about what she wants out of life, which is, control her own destiny and be free of this sort of prison she's been in, and this is sort of a mini story within that of establishing her stakes and then seeing what happens with those stakes as we go on.
Yeah, and this is actually part of the shipping level too, which is this building that you're trying to get to.
So one thing that a lot of people ask us about is this sort of scripted versus non-scripted nature of the level, and there are parts of it obviously that are scripted, but there's interesting that the store. A lot of people thought that like Elizabeth, all the things to do with Elizabeth in the store were quite scripted and play out the same way every time. And actually, that's not the case. Like in the store, we have this system where basically there are bits of business that Elizabeth or other characters can take on, and depending on what the player is doing, depending on how appropriate it is, depending if there's combat going on, Elizabeth may or may not, or other characters may or may not do those sequences. They just sort of like improvise. They have a library of things they can do, and they look to see around, is this a good time to do that?
If the character had taken another route through the story, you may not have seen the Lincoln mask at all. That may have been something that will show up at a later store or a later exploration.
Yeah. And we have a system that sort of watches it and sees and looks for opportunities, basically. And we're going to talk more about that later, but I think it's when you watch a system at play and seeing Elizabeth just sort of reacting to you now, and we're sort of working through that. That has a million kinks, so we're working through all those kinks. That is really going to be a really interesting component of this game and make everybody's play experience feel quite different.
Yes, that's true.
That bit right there was interesting. The New York bit. Nate, you want to talk about how that came about?
Sure. We really wanted to communicate that Liz only had moderate control of her powers, and one of the reasons they need to get to Comstock House is that Liz is losing control of her powers. It's getting incredibly dangerous for her to use them. And we pitched a bunch of different things to show that. Initially, it wasn't a horse; it was a dog, which was too small visually. Initially, the park would just get nicer, and then it got stranger with different plants, a sort of primordial forest. And then we realized that none of that was going to read. And Stephen and Ken sort of simultaneously came up with this idea. We had some modern assets. We gave it a shot, and it almost immediately worked. And then we spent some time after that refining it.
But those assets we just had sitting around from our prototype of a game, which we never made, and which we never talked about actually before. We never told anybody about that game. We still haven't told anybody about that game,
sure.
and that's still a top secret thing. But all of a sudden we had all these assets. Like a day later, Stephen had put together that whole New York scene. The movie marquee came later, but that to really set the time, exactly what time it was.
So here we have you in the midst of the Vox occupation here.
This is another example of our system putting AIs doing stuff as you're walking up the stairs.
Yeah, and the AIs, we have the ability, like you saw that guy beating up the other guy a moment ago. AIs can just sort of look around to each other opportunistically and say, like, hey, I'm available to do something cool. And then the other AI would say, yeah, well, why don't you come beat the crap out of me? Yeah. And they'll just sort of dynamically do that if that opportunity is available.
If it makes sense in the context of the situation.
Getting this working in the actual game, which, you'll see, is like, what if the player turned around and started running the other direction? Elizabeth will have to, walk in the other direction or follow him, and that scene still needs to play out and make sense. So that's, we have all these very complicated systems.
And those systems are more than just curry. It's more than just a behavior system to make the city look alive. It can provide gameplay opportunities for the player, too. So it's, something you want to perceive and keep an eye on. Here's a bit of the aesthetic of what we decided for the Vox Populi. When they take over an area of the city, the original thought was that they make it bleed. And that led us to the idea that, they basically paper the city with these red sheets, these red rags, and it gives the overall impression that the buildings, these rich, affluent buildings, are actually bleeding onto the street. And it also gave them their color, which is red.
Yes.
To have as compared to the founders who sort of built the city, the Vox Populi are sort of imprinting themselves on top of the city.
Yes.
So you have to have the original aesthetic of the founders underneath, and then the Vox Populi aesthetic.
And you can see the Vox Populi here dressed in